Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Yud Tes, and on Yud Ches Hamid Beis there's a long Mishnah, many parts of it which will be relevant to daf Yud Tes. Let's just see one part of the Mishnah that will help us here on daf Yud Tes, and that is the statement in the Mishnah that with regard to Nedarim, we have a principle called Stam Nedarim Lahachmir. And the Mishnah goes on to give an example of that, and maybe even more than one examples of that. And the case, let's say, of Cherem, where we have also a suffix, and then we get to the issue called suffix Nazirus. And it would seem from the Gemara that although the Mishnah's principles seem to be in suffix Machmir, yet there's a Mishnah in Taros in the fourth parak that we want to study, which indicates that in a suffix we could be Mekil. And we'll go through various parts of that Mishnah in Taros. But right now the Gemara says that in the Mishnah in Taros it says Safek Nazirus le Hakel, which is the exact opposite of Stam Nedarim Lahachmir. And Rabbi Zera is making an attempt at reconciling this by saying these are two different Tanoim in a Machlokes Tanoim between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanon about a case of Makdish Chaiso Ubehemto. So he was Makdish all his Chayos in his possession, all his Behemos. And the question is, what is the status of a Koi? A Koi is a Safek Chayos, Safek Behemo. And Rabbi Eliezer said that when he was Makdish, his interest, his intention was all his Chayos and all his Behemos, and nothing that has a suffix, only that which is absolutely clear. And therefore, Rabbi Zera says that you see that according to Rabbi Eliezer, we're not going to apply the principle of suffix lahachmir and say, well, maybe a koi is a behema, and therefore it's part of his hegdish of behemoths. Maybe it's a chayot, part of his hegdish of chayos. But rather, we're going to say that it's not kadosh misafek. And Rabbi Zera is going to use that to explain that the Mishnah in Taros that records the rule of Safek and Zirus Lahaka reflects the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer. Our Mishnah here, Safek L'chumra, represents the Shita of the Chachamim, who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and they say the principle called Mamono Ma'ayel L'Sveika, that a person, in a case of a suffix, he's going to be Magdish his Mamon. And Rabbi Zera is going to take that principle of the Chachamim in the Mishnah in Taros with regard to whether or not his Koi is Kadosh or not, and apply it to Nazirus. And that's called Gufe Nami Ma'ayel. However, according to Rabbi Eliezer, we have a Kal V'chomer. Rabbi Eliezer says, Mamono lo Ma'ayel Sveka, when a person is considering his Mamon that's in a state of suffix, like a Koi, and he's Magdish his Mamon, he doesn't have in mind that which is a suffix. And therefore, Gufe, and here we turn to today's daf, which is on the top of Yud Tes, Kolshkein Loma Ayel Sfeika. A person certainly is more makbid on his guf, as a general rule, than on his mamon. And yet, we find with regard to his mamon, in the case of Koi, Rabbi Eliezer says that a person does not include a suffix like a Koi in his hegdish. And that's a din in Mamon. So it doesn't become Mamon Hegdish B'Kinyono. How much more so a person would be very hesitant in a case of his guf, like for example, that the Nazir should be chal in his guf, that in a suffix, his Kabbal's Naziris should include his guf as well. And his guf should be kadosh b'kedushas Naziris. So therefore, says Rabbi Zera, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the principle is stam nedarim lo hakel. Our mission, on the other hand, is machmir and stam nedarim in a suffix and reflects the sheet of the Rabbanon that in Higdish Koi it's kadosh, and a person is machnis his suffix into his mammon or his kinyoni mammon, and he's magdish it. And if he's machmir in mammon, in a case of suffix, then likewise he'd be machmir in the case of guf of suffix neder lahach. So just to summarize, what we're saying is that if a person utilizes a lashon that's a suffix, we don't know how to interpret it, or we'll have a case later on where he was makabel on himself Nazirus b'tanai, and we don't know if the tanai was fulfilled or not, because the object of the tanai was lost. So if we go with the Rabbanan Shita, we're going to say Adam machnis atzmo suffix, includes his suffix in the Isur or in the Hakadosha. So the neder will be chal misafek. On the other hand, Rabbi Eliezer holds, no, a person is not machnis his mammon in safek, and certainly not his guf, and therefore safek nedarim lekula. Amalei Abaye. Now Abaye is going to make an analogy which is very problematic, but let's try the best we can to make some sense out of Abaye's analogy. But Mayim Kimtul Safik Nazirus Lahachik Rabbi Eliezer, according to which Tana would you attribute the Shita that Safik Nazirus is Lahakel? And your logic, Rabbi Zera, is that since Lagabe Hegdish, in the case of Chayas Ubehemos, the Koi is not included in the Hegdish, according to Rabbi Eliezer, therefore, Rabbi Eliezer, in that mission in Taras, is maintaining Safek Lakula, and he's the one who holds that with regard to a Safek Neder, it's Lakula. So Abaye now challenges Rabbi Zera by looking at the Sefer of that very same Mishnah in the fourth parak of Taharas. And the Mishnah says the following. So he says, Amos Sefer, Safek Bechoros, Echad b'char adam v'echad b'char behema tmeya. So we have now a case of a vlad that was born, and we're not sure of its status. Let's say, for example, two vlados were born, twins, a zocher and a keva. We don't know if the zocher was born first, and that's called Peter Rechem, and he is therefore sanctified with Kedushas B'char, and it's Mammon Cohen, it's one of the Matnas Kahuna. Or perhaps the Nekeva came out first, and the Zocher is not a Bechor. And the Mishnah establishes that in all these cases of Safek Bechor, we're going to apply the universal principle of Hamotzi Mechavel Varai. If the Kohen comes and he wants to claim that this is a Bechor, and therefore comes to him, or alternatively, give me a pigeon, the Kohen has the burden of proof because he's being motzi momen michavero. Now, what we have to analyze here is, okay, the Bechor will remain in the possession of the Yisrael where it was born, because the Yisrael is saying, motzi michavero varaya. We have what's called the drawer, the mamona suffix, an objective suffix. But what about the Iser Bechor? Because as we learned a few days ago, a Bechor is kadosh mirechem imo. And there's a 50% chance that this Zohar is actually a Bechor, and it is now vested with Kedusha, which would generate an Isur of Gizav Avodah, as we'll soon just see in a minute. So the first part of the Sefer of the Mishnah is addressing the Mammon part. And Echad Bechor Behema Tmeya, Bein Tmeya Ubein Tahora, Motzi Mechaver Olav Haraya. So, for example, in a Peter Chamor, which is a Behemoth Tmeya, that you have to be poder the chamor with a seh and give the seh over to the Kohen, or in the case of Bechor of a behemoth tahora, the halach is you either give the Bechor to the Kohen or your poder, and the Kohen has the burden of proof. If he can't prove, then he can't be motzi mama miyada Yisrael. But v'toli Allah, but with regard to the status of this suffix, with regard to Isur, we have a brisa that is an addendum to the Mishnah in Safek Bechor, and Asura begizav avoda. The brisa establishes that despite the fact that in Hamotzi Mechavel Varaya in the moment context, the Kohen cannot the motzi, the baila without bringing a raya, but nevertheless the animal remains a suffix isa b'chor, and therefore it's also the gizav avoda like any vade b'chor, because a behema kedosha is asura b'gizav avoda. You're not allowed to cut off its wool, shear off the wool of its back. You're not allowed to work with such an animal because it might be kodesh b'kedusha. So we see that even the spekos, like for example, we don't know whether the zohar came out first or the nekeva came out first, and therefore the status of the zohar is in question. Nevertheless, it's also to shear off the wool off its back. You're not allowed to do work with it. So therefore, says Abaye, we cannot interpret our Mishnah of Safek Nazirus Lahakil, meaning the Mishnah in Taros, as reflecting the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that when you makdish something, you don't include Safek in the case of Kohen, when we see clearly that this Tana is going to apply the principle of Isur b'Safek b'Char. It's Kadosh as far as generating the Isur Gizav Avodah. Now, in truth, this question of Abaye is really not to be leveled against Rabbi Zera. In and of itself, there seems to be a contradiction in the Mishnah, and that's what the Ran Dibra Maskil V'Toni Allah points out, that even without Rabbi Zera, there seems to be a steer in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says that as far as Koi is concerned, we're going to paskin L'Kula, which means that a suffix neder or called suffix nazirus is lahakil, and yet in the suffix bechor it's also the gizav avodah. So why did Abaye victimize? Why did he single out Rabbi Zera for admonishment here? Why is he asking a kasha on Rabbi Zera? Abaye's kasha is irrelevant to Rabbi Zera. Again, it's Rabbi Zera who says that the Mishnah reflects the shita of Rabbi Eliezer, who holds ein on the magdish spekos. But that's what it says in the Mishnah. I mean, forget about Abaye. So the Ran points out that as far as the Mishnah itself is concerned, we could say that the reason why we were makil in Stam Nazirus is because ein adam machnis gufo l'safek, and therefore we're going to be makil as far as whether or not he wants to become a nazir in a suffix situation. But in case of mammon, then adam machnis es mamono l'safek, and therefore, in a case of Safek Bechor, we're going to say that as far as the moment is concerned, well, we're going to say it's L'Kula. That's as far as the dimension of the Kohen is concerned, if he wants to pick up and lay claim to this Bechor. But as far as being Magdish, Magdish, the animal, the Bechor itself, but it has Kedusha Mirechem Imo, we're going to have to be Machmir. So therefore, Abaye levels his kasha against Rabbi Zera. Amalei, Rabbi Zera says to Abaye, what kind of analogy are you making here? What underlies the premise of your kasha? In the case of Bechor, the Kedusha is Chal Mirechem Imo, regardless of whether he was Magdish it. It's not a Kedusha that he generated. And therefore, we don't have to go into questions as of whether he wanted to include a suffix or not suffix, but l'kedusha ba midei adam, that's a whole different story. If you have a kedusha that's generated by a person, then we could say that it depends upon his das, and Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that in the case of kedusha ba midei adam, ein daito shetochel kedusha ala suffix. But in the case of a kedusha atzmo, which comes essentially by virtue of the mitzias of the animal, that's a suffix b'char, and it's also b'gizav avoda. The kedusha ba me'eleh. And I see here that there's a whole literature here, the Rashba and others who want to make sense out of the svar of Abaye, the underlying premise of his analogy to compare kedusha ba me'eleh to kedusha ba lidei adam. Kedusha ba lidei adam, a person has, the svara is that ain't on the makish b'safek. But in kedusha ba me'eleh, we have a safek doraisa. In any event, there's apparently a lot of Torah here from Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky on this issue. Now, the Gemara is going to say that Rabbi Zera, don't think that you're in Gansen Potter, you're protected from any onslaught. We have a kasha on your premise, which, although Abayi's kasha is not a kasha, but we have a different kasha from a brisa in Masechet Taras. Now, the Torah says in the 11th chapter of Vayikra, called Mashke Asher Yishase Bechol Kli Yitma. And we don't know how to interpret this pasuk. And it's a machlokas Tanoim in Masechet Psachim Daf Tezayim, in the famous sugya of Taras of Chanidas Gan Konim at the end of the first parak of Psachim. According to some Tanoim, and there's a three-way machlokas, mashkim are makabel tumah min Torah, and a step further, they can also convey tumah. So when it says in the pasuk yitma, it means yitame acherim. Another school of thought amongst the Tanoim is that min Torah mashkim are makabel tumah, but they don't transmit tumah to dvar macherim, and the pasuk yitama Yitma only means that the mashkim receive tumah, they're contaminated. According to that second shita, the entire enterprise that mashkim are mitamim is only derabbanan. There's a third shita that maintains that mashkim are not makabel tumah at all. When the pasuk says that a mashki yitma, the intention of the Torah is that mashke is a machshir l'kabel tumah, and when the liquids of mashkim fall onto a vegetable, etc., it's machshir the ochel to be makabel tumah, and the entire enterprise of tumas mashkim, even as far as the halach that the mashkim themselves are contaminated, that's all exer d'rabbanan. Those are the three sheets. Eli kasha hakash. Let's learn the Tosefta in Taras in the 5th parak. This is going to be the kasha against Rabbi Zera. The brisa says safek mashkim. If you have a case of mashkim that are tahorim, and now we have a safek, maybe they were makabel tumah. For example, let's say a tameh extended his arm amongst different mashkim. We don't know if he touched this mashke or that one. Or let's say he takes a piece of bread, a loaf of bread, and the loaf of bread is itself tmeah, and he throws it into a pile that has mashkim tahorim, and we don't know where it was nogea. Was it nogea in the mashkim? Was it not? And in all these cases, the brisa establishes that litame, if the suffix is when the mashkim were makabel tumah or not, then tamen. Why? Because this brisa reflects the shita that tumas mashkin, as far as kabbalas tumah is concerned, is doraisa, and therefore the suffix we have to be machmir. But litame acherim, according to this shita, that's the middle shita that we spoke about, that when it says in the pasuk yitma, what it's referring to is that it receives tumah, but it cannot transmit to him on a Daraisa level, and therefore the entire enterprise that Mashkim Tmeim or Mitame Acherim, that's only a rabbinic law. It's only a D'Rabbanan, and therefore the Safek Torah. And all this, the Brisa records in the name of Rabbi Meir. But the Brisa goes a step further and tells us that Chein Hoy Rabbi I think there's a Gersa mistake here. Yeah. The issue here is whether it should be Rabbi Lazar or Rabbi Eliezer. There's a whole discussion in the Rashash. And Kidvara. So Rabbi Eliezer agrees to the Shita of Rabbi Meir. And now we're ready for a kasha on Rabbi Zera. Umi svira leila Rabbi Eliezer li tame tame. Is it possible that Rabbi Eliezer, in the case of mashke, whether or not they receive contamination, and we have a suffix, and Rabbi Eliezer is going to say we have to be machmir? No, that's not Rabbi Eliezer's shita. Rabbi Eliezer's shita is that even as far as Kabbalas Tumas Mashke is concerned, that too is the Rabban. Vatanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ein Tumal Mashke Kol Ikar, not only as far as being Mitame Acher, but even as far as being Mitame Atzma. And the Brisa records that Rabbi Eliezer quotes an edus of Yossi ben Yoezer, Ish Tzreda, one of the early Tanoim, Teda, Sharei Heid, Yossi ben Yoezer, Ish Tzreda, Ayol Kamza, the Al-Mashkin based with Chaya Dochan. Dochan means Tahorim. So there are two different transmissions here of two different dinim. They're both relevant to Tuma Vitara, but they shouldn't be confused. They're two statements that came as testimony from Yossi ben Yoezer by Rabbi Eliezer. One has to do with a certain grasshopper that's called kamsa. It's called ayol. So the word kamsa means in modern Hebrew chagav, and ayol is the name of a certain kind of a grasshopper. So kamsa means chagav, and ayol is the name of that species of chagav. And it looks like other chagavim, but we're not sure what its status is, comes along the edus of Yossi and establishes that that particular species is tar. And that, again, tar here means primarily that it's mutar b'achila. Now, there are chagavim that are mutar b'achila, there are those that are sur b'achila. We lost the Masorah on how to identify which chagav we're allowed to eat. However, there are not too many, but a few old-time Yemenites that claim they have the Masorah. They eat certain grasshoppers. But we needed the testimony of Yossi ben Yoezer about this particular species of chagav, that it's mutter, it's not one of the shkatzim hasurim. Then we have another edus on mashkin Beis Mitbachaya. This is a place in the Beis Hamikdash where they did the shchita, the karbanos. And for example, if you find mashkim in that slaughterhouse in the Beis Hamikdash, like for example, you find dam kodshi, or you find mayim that they used over there to rinse off the meat, and so forth and so on. So in that case, it's all tar. It's not makabel tumah, meaning mashkim themselves are not makabel tumah. Forget about transmitting tumah; they're not even makabel tumah themselves. And this was the edus of Rabbi Eliezer in the name of Yossi ben Yoezer. So again, this halacha that is being transmitted here, that the mashkim of the Beis Hamikdash are not makabel tumah, that's only an application of the general rule that mashkim are not makabel tumah. And even though elsewhere it might be d'Rabbanan, but in the Beis Hamikdash it's tar. But the bottom line is that Rabbi Eliezer is now contradicting himself, because if he holds that Tumas Mashkin themselves are only D'Rabbanan, why was he Machmir in a case where there was a suffix whether or not a Dover Tomei came in contact with the Mashkin? The Chachamim only made Xera on Bada and not on suffix. And the Gemara says that this Shita, this question, is only difficult according to the Shita of Rav. There's Machlokas, Rav, and Shmuel. Let's go through the Shita of Shmuel first. Hanicha, we can work this out and reconcile this with Shmuel. The Omar Shmuel holds regarding the ages of Yossi ben Yuez that Dachan, what does the word Dachan Tar mean? Milatame Achteret. In other words, the enterprise of Mashkim transmitting to him is only D'Rabbanan. But, and then in base with Bachai, the base, something they didn't institute text there. Aval Tuma Atzmon, as far as the Mashkin receiving Tuma, Yesh Bahem, there is Tuma. And this applies even in the Mashkin base with Bachai, because we're dealing with Tuma Doraisa, and the Mashkin are Makabel Tuma Doraisa, like that Tana in the Sugya at the end of the first parak of Pesachim, the Shapar. Now we understand that which Rabbi Eliezer says that in a suffix Mashkin, and we don't know if it was Makabel Tuma or not, then we're going to say suffix Tuma, Tomit, because Tumas Atzmon is the Oraisa. And in a suffix, we have to be Machmir. But as far as being Matami Acherim, which is only D'Rabbanan, then we say suffix Lahakir. So everything works out beautifully. El Rav, the Yom Rav, says that as far as the testimony of Yossi ben Yoezer is concerned, with regard to the Mashke Beibid B'chaya, is Dachan Mamish, that tar completely, even as far as Tumas Atzmon, because Tumas Atzmon itself is D'Rabbanan, which means on a Doraisa level, Mashkim are excluded not only from transmitting Tumah, but even from receiving Tumah, is Ma'ikal Nema. How can you defend Rabbi Zera? If the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Zera of Safek Nazirus Lahakil, reflects the Shita Rabbi Eliezer, which means that a Safek Doraisa we are going to be Mekil on, then in the case of Safek Tumas Mashkin, why would we say that on a Tumah D'Rabbanan you're going to be Machmir? So based on this kasha, we come to the conclusion that it's impossible to attribute the mission of Safek Nazirus Lahakil to Rabbi Eliezer. We got to find a different candidate Tana to be Mamid the Mishnah according to the Shita. Elaha Rabbi Yehuda, Veha Rabbi Shimon. This time you have a brisa that records a machlok between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon in the case of a Nazir on Tzai. Already Nazir in Yesh Bekri Hazeh Me'akur. If in this pile of Tvua there's Me'akur, and it means he was Makabel Naziris only on a condition. Now the Kri is gone. It was either stolen or went up in flames or got lost, whatever it means. And there's no way of clarifying whether in fact the Tanai was fulfilled in the Me'akurim. And on this issue, we have Machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda, who's Matir, and he allows the Noda to drink wine, and all the other Yisuri Naziris are inapplicable, and he's Mutter. He's not a Nazir because the Naziris is not Chal Misafek. And that's based on the fact that a person does not have Das to become a Nazir unless it's absolutely certain, it's clear, and it was clarified that the Kri has Me'akurim. He doesn't want to be a Nazir if he cannot clarify that the Tanai was fulfilled. Rav Shimon Oser, Rav Shimon looks at the Tanai in objective terms, and when you look at the Tanai, it says, Almanas, that there should be Me'akur. Maybe in fact there are, or there were, I should say, Me'akur, and therefore the Nazirus was Chal. So we have basically an Isa Nazirus Misafek, and therefore Rav Shimon applies the principle of Safek, Doraisa L'chum. Rabbi Yehuda is arguing that let's look at the Das of the Noder. When he took upon himself Nazirus, he says, that's only because it's Me'akur. He wanted to be absolutely certain about that. So it turns out, if we summarize now based on this last brisa, we have machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about the das hanodir. And Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that the nodir does not want the nazirs to be chal in his suffix. Or do we say no? Even in the case of a suffix, his das, as Rabbi Shimon would argue, is to be makabel naziris misafek. So therefore, we're going to say that the Tana of our Mishnah, who holds that Stam Nedarim Lahachmir, is Rabbi Shimon, and Stam Naziris Lahakil is Rabbi Yehuda. So now the Gemara says, but wait a minute, we have an inner contradiction as far as the Shita Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda. Miyam Rabbi Yehuda Loma Ayel Inish Nafshi L'Speika. Are you telling me based on Rabbi Yehuda in the Brisa that if we cannot clarify for sure that there's Mea Kur, the Naziris is not Chal Misafek because a person is not Machnis Atzma L'Safek, and therefore Naziris is always going to be Safek L'Kula? Is that really Rabbi Yehuda's Shita or Mini? I'll ask you a question from a Mishnah. A second, let me tell you where the Mishnah is. Oh yeah, our Mishnah, sorry. Is Rabbi Yehuda Omer Stam True Rabbi Yehuda Asura Begolil Muteres Sheinan Sheagol Makiris Trumas Alishka. When we have a suffix of a person who is makdis a kikar in Truma Stam, and we don't know what Truma Stam is referring to. Is it Trumas Halishka, which is a Davar Nodur, or is it Trumas Goren, which is a Davar Asur? And you may recall a few days ago we spoke about the Rosh, that Trumas Goren is a Davar Asur because it's really Tevel, and it was an Isur even before he went in, he was Mafreshit. And Rabbi Yehuda now differentiates between two parts of Eretz Yisrael. In Yehuda, there we assume that he was Makdis in Trumas Halishka. That's what people have in mind when they talk about Truma. Whereas in Galil, if he took the neder in Galil, then we assume that his kavanah was that he wants to match this in regular Truma Askani. And therefore it's a davar also, not a davar mudar, and the hatfas is not chal, the neder is chal muteret. Sheinan shigol makir in Trumas Halishka. They were very far away from Yerushalayim, and it was only on rare occasion that they would bring truma for the lishka, and when they used the word truma stam, what they meant was truma of a kohen, not truma salishka. So now the Gemara is going to be medayek from Rabbi Yehuda's statement about the Anshe Golil Kaima. The reason why stam hatfas of the truma in Golil was mutter is the ein makirin, because they're not familiar, they're not used to having contact with Trumas Halishka. It's not part of their, shall we say, their daily life. So therefore we assume that they meant, and they had in mind, being matfis in Trumas Karnim, Trumas Goren, not in Trumas Halishka.